So methane synthesis basically requires a coupling of two cycles. The first one is the folate cycles, which folate is B9, and the second cycle is the methionine cycle. And what really couples those two is B12.
Welcome to Rumination, the podcast that discusses key areas to enhance ruminant production. Hi, I'm Chris Green, your host, and today I'm talking with Dr. Ousama Alzahal, president and founder of Azahal Innovation and Nutrition, who currently works as a consultant, offering technical and research advice to companies around the world. Dr. Alzahal trained and worked as a veterinarian before completing his MSc in ruminant nutrition and his PhD in animal biochemistry, both at the University of Guelph, where he also taught for a number of years in the Department of Animal Nutrition. Along with 8 years of industry experience in feed ingredients and over 20 years of experience, Dr. Alzahal has developed a solid knowledge and understanding of animal health and clinical nutrition, with an emphasis on nutritional and metabolic disorders in ruminants. Dr. Alzahal, thank you for joining us today on Rumination.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me. I appreciate that. And thank you for the audience. I look forward to providing valuable information.
No, it's a pleasure. And today we're going to dig down deeper into kind of amino acid balancing of and formulation of early lactation diets, which I think is an area that always needs improvement. So I was hoping, Dr. Alzahal, you would expand a bit to our audience and talk to them about meeting the nutrient needs of the early lactation cow. In particular, making sure we have high health, high component yield, and successful rebreeding. And we're hoping you could expand on the audience some of the challenges and the opportunities in that area.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is really an important topic that we've always, find ourselves always going back to discussing with farmers and producers. And it's, cows have different requirements and these requirement changes throughout the whole lactation. Sure. And it is important that we ensure that these nutrients are delivered precisely and accurately. And that just not only includes the amount of feed that we do, not quantitatively, but also the concentration of these nutrients and also the bioavailability of those nutrients. So hence it's important to measure dry matter intake as much as possible, how much we're feeding on farm, and also do a frequent assessment of forage analysis and ration balancing. So grouping cows, it's been really important improving that on farm. Cows and the grouping density also plays a huge role. So fresh cows ideally should receive a diet that's higher in nutrient density than the rest of the herd. First lactation cows, which are often grouped with the others, these first lactation cows has higher requirement for growth that's sometimes forgotten than the other mature cows. So all that should be taken into account, and also, not only they have different requirements, but also they are bullied by the other mature cows, and that affects their intake and well-being, and so on.
So some of those social stressors that we need to keep in mind in early lactation, in particular, when grouping first lactation animals and mature animals together, and then group size and number of days in the fresh cow group, et cetera.
Yeah, so when we get a fresh group in some of the bigger herds, the approach is basically to give enough days in milk postpartum, enough in those fresh pens, and also in some herds that separate the first lactation fresh cows from the 2+ fresh cows to ensure that these cows receive the amount of nutrients and the concentration of nutrients that they require. Yeah.
When it comes to early lactation diets more specifically, today and perhaps in the near future, specifically what should we be doing better in order to meet their nutrient needs of those lactating cows? In essence, what do we need to do to ensure a really successful transition from pre-fresh to high-performing, healthy cows in those first month of lactation?
Yes, I like using the term successful transition. Mm-hmm. This is really meaningful, Chris. So a cow that go through the parturition, Basically, the first 20 days is the most critical, as we all know. But these cows, if they're successful, they're basically to breed more effectively and earlier, and they'll have higher peak, which is, for the remaining 200 days after that, or 300 days, 250 days, they'll probably be just cruising and delivering what they're promised. The issue with these cows, they're not different from the other cows, except that they cannot consume enough diet.
Okay.
Their dry matter intake is much lower. So if you look at the rumen size of a cow that just calved, it's half what it would be when she's 60 days in milk. Hence, cows peak later on days in milk with their rumen size catch up. And that's not the same. So that there's differences between primiporous and multiporous cows. So they eat less. That means we've got to deliver much more of these nutrients in a smaller package. So basically, a mature cow at peak of intake, they can eat about, maybe 25, some of them 26, 27, up to 28. These cows are limited below 20 and 17 kilogram. But having said that, we just want to make sure that we deliver enough effective fiber. So particle sizes are great because we don't want to get into issues with subacute ruminal acidosis or some of these displacement that occurs in that early stage. Maintaining rumen function is a must. As we know, in ruminant, we feed cows fiber to generate microbial cells. These microbes that grow and ferment these forages are basically the main source for amino acids. So amino acid that reach the intestine is 60 to 85% generated from those microbes. So maintaining rumen function at the same time delivering a diet that nutrient dense. It's a win-win in both situations where we rely on forages to maintain, to deliver that protein, but at the same time ensure that these cows cover the requirements when it comes to various nutrients.
So paying attention to forage and forage particle size and meals and feed delivery and what the cows can actually eat, and then digging deeper into specific nutrient requirements that those animals need. Because I think, as you had said earlier, there's a big opportunity for negative nutrient balances. Can you expand a bit more on how negative nutrient balances may play into hampering the performance of those early lactation cows?
So cows can eat enough to produce that amount of milk. And it runs into what we refer to very grossly as negative energy balance. But basically, energy itself is not a nutrient, but basically that term encompasses a number of nutrients. So cows during that time, they are actually false negative in protein. So that will be a negative protein balance, minerals, vitamins, and some of these important molecule, like the methyl group, similar to methionine, choline, betaine, and so on. So to summarize all that in a term, negative energy, just kind of gives you the sense of just feeding carbohydrates and go away with it. But this is more and more, especially for first lactating cows, as they require higher amino acid requirements devoted for their growth and so on.
And so you mentioned amino acids. Where do they play in that early lactation diet? What role do
amino acids, unfortunately, we've done a lot of research recently and focused on methionine and lysine, and now we're basically talking about more of the other, more research having include some other amino acids, which is great. But amino acids, let's say methionine and lysine, they're not just essential amino acid, but they rather play a critical role in the metabolism. For example, methionine is a methyl group donor. It is the precursor of what's called SAM, or S-adenosyl methionine, which is a source, universal methyl group donor for over 100 important metabolic processes. And it also plays a role in the immune system, plays a role in redox defense. Same thing, lysine. Lysine is, is a precursor for example, carnitine. Carnitine plays a significant role in shuttling those fatty acids into mitochondria to generate energy. I think it caught my attention, a paper from Illinois, where they basically fed lysine before calving, then prepartum, and they've seen an improvement in energy-corrected milk and milk component post calving, which make a lot of sense because they're during that close-up, dry period, most of the mammary development takes place, right?
Okay.
In addition to the heightened fetus growth as well. So amino acids will go just beyond being an essential part of essential amino acids, as we understanding its conventional way into molecules that play a significant role in the metabolism.
You talked earlier about negative nutrient balances, which I'd love to expand a bit upon, and in particular, maybe how the role of dry matter intake plays in those negative nutrient balances and the role of how that impacts perhaps B vitamin synthesis, which you also mentioned earlier.
That's a great question, Chris. There actually new research, new modeling coming out from University of Guelph, Jen Ellis's lab, where they're actually showing that they tried to model the ruminal output of B vitamins. I think they precisely were working about B12, where they've seen that one of the biggest predictors for the output of B vitamins is basically dry matter intake. Yeah. And that goes back into the first point where cows cannot eat enough during early stage to cover requirements, and they run into negative balances. And that's probably be a good example. Now, B vitamins are very unique. Is that dietary requirements is insufficient or basically non-existing, especially for B12, and the ruminant animal rely on ruminal synthesis. So we mentioned about how important it is to maximize the amount of microbial yield, amount of microbial cells that leaves a rumen. So B vitamins are synthesized by those rumen bugs, and the quantity of these B vitamins that leave the rumen is really, attached to how much intake and how much these microbial yield is. So it's a very good question, and there's quite some interesting research that also came in from I think from Agriculture and Agri Canada to Places et al. 2020, where they've basically also looked at B12 and B9. I guess, and they looked at the concentration in feces, blood, and milk, and they really showed some interesting results where the amount of B12 and B9 were driven by the type of diet, the stage of lactation, and season as well. I mean, these factors are a little bit confounded, but interesting results. I think B12 were more driven by diets, or basically it's a correlation, so I have to be careful with phrasing that, by the amount of fiber in the diet versus folic acid, or B9 was driven by a certain component, which is the non-NDF and starch. There's more research, I think, was done by University of McGill. It's kind of interesting, where they've tried to correlate separate populations of microbes in the rumen with certain, with the level of B vitamins or B12. And, they can really attribute it to, it's a more correlative study, can attribute it, but there was some variation. The example that really sticks in my mind is that Provitella. Provitella is a species, this genus, they basically do not produce B12, but they're utilizers. They utilize a lot of the B vitamins. So more research is coming. It's interesting into, differentiating which one of these bugs is utilizers and producers. But the point is, the animal is simply relying on the outcome of these, or basically on the ruminant output of these B vitamins. And the reason that I brought Provitella is that if you have a high Provitella with the starchy diet in these diets, there are probably more of the bugs will utilize it and will not a lot will basically leave that rumen. So it's really interesting, and it's a very active area of research at this point. But B vitamins in general are I think defining requirements is very difficult, and I guess now with the NASEM 21, we're more using what would be an adequate response. An adequate response could be defined by based on measuring the response, whether it's milk productive or repro and others. The field studies, a few papers have also been looked at field studies where they've seen some positive effect of supplementing with rumen productive vitamins. So it's very promising. It's an interesting area of research, that's for sure.
No, it is, and as you said, it's ruminal production, and therefore driven. Though there are impacts of different diets, heavily driven by the amount that the animal's eating, and so during periods of stress, or in particular in early lactation, where intake relative to production is quite low, there's likely imbalances, and though it's an intense subject and fairly scientific, talking about methyl groups and methyl donors, you talked earlier about the role of methionine contributing and to create methyl groups through SAM, but also there's a key point where B12 and folic acid, I think, play as well, right?
Yeah, that's true. Methionine is an essential amino acid, but there's some misunderstanding that mammals cannot synthesize it. There's a methionine cycle.
Okay.
That methionine is synthesized. The reason it's essential is because that we cannot synthesize enough from methionine, and that's given that its involvement just beyond being just an essential amino acid. So methionine synthesis basically requires a coupling of two cycles. The first one is the folate cycles, which folate is B9, and the second cycle is the methionine cycle. And what really couples those two is B12. So basically, if you've got a deficiency of B12, can lead a secondary deficiency in folic acid and B9. Okay. And I think there's quite a significant amount of research from Christine Gerard's lab, just showing how the status of these two B vitamins are basically linked. But the link is more important in relation to methionine synthesis. So methionine, the status of these B vitamins, it was suggested that could influence the methionine status and amino acid homeostasis as well. So it is an interesting, it's an interesting topic, and it's as we said in the previous question, so kind of relate to the type of diet, from the function, and it all. It makes sense when you try to, follow that domino effect of some sort of negative energy balance and how it's interconnected. So methionine is a really interesting how it's very well connected and also plays role in the transsulfuration pathways, which is production of antioxidants. Yep. So it's a very interesting topic. I didn't want to get too techy on this, but you asked the question.
Absolutely. And the goal of our podcast today is to get a bit technical because we want to dig deep into some of these topics. But it makes sense as we wrap out to leave some take-home points for nutritionists and veterinarians and dairy producers in relation to the topic that we've been talking about, is trying to meet the nutrient needs of the early lactation cow. And so maybe if you could, for our audience, leave them with 2 or 3 take-home messages about how they should be feeding and managing those early lactation cows for optimal performance.
Yes. My main point is cows are not the same. I think we all know this. This is not new, but what we do about it that's what will make a difference. So how do we feed these cows, how we group them, the efforts into managing these cows and delivering precise nutrients to these cows can make a lot of difference. Again, the bottom line is how many it's not how many liters end up in the bulk tank, is how many cows contributed to that. So having less cows to produce more is basically the bottom line. And that's where every farmer and every farmer I visit is, can I reduce the number of cows? And that's basically should be the goal, is how many cows I can reduce to get this amount of liters. Again, that speaks efficiency and then sustainability. And it's much better for the environment. So it's a win-win for everyone.
No, absolutely. So performance per animal, enhancing that, maintain the health, and really focusing on these early lactation cows is a key opportunity to enhance health, enhance reproductive performance while increasing milk component yield. So thank you for your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Azahal, it was a real pleasure to meet with you today and discuss with you. So thank you for sharing with our audience.
Anytime.
And I surely want to thank our audience for listening to us so that you don't miss our next episode of Jefo Rumination Podcast. You can find us at jefo.ca, Apple and Google Podcast, and Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world.